So it's the combination of solar heating and the strong heating at the equator and cooling at the poles and the transport of heat from the tropics to the poles that creates this driving force for the circulation. But because of the Coriolis effect and because of the rotation of the Earth, the circulation cell of the atmosphere doesn't form one single continuous circulation cell. It converts this into three, it breaks down into essentially three cells. So we've got rising air at the equator as we expected, and then we've got that air actually sinks down in the mid-latitudes. And then it creates also a second cell that moves northward along the surface of the planet and returns back towards the equator at altitude. And then the third and final cell moves in a clockwise direction when viewed from this side and transport as air moves from the pole towards the mid-latitudes along the surface and then returns at the high latitudes. And again, this is driven in part by the rising air here, the sinking air here, and the Coriolis effect that breaks down what would otherwise be a single continuous cell. So the result is that along the surface, if we translate these motions into what the force is along the surface, these create near the equator what are called the trade winds that blow along the equator, and again they're being deflected slightly to the right, to the north of the equator. And then we've got deflection to the left, slightly just south of the equator. And these are the trade winds. To the north of that, we've got the westerlies, which are blowing primarily towards the east. And they do get slightly deflected to the right as well. And then in the very high northern latitudes, we've got the polar easterlies, which are moving back in the other direction, corresponding to this surface recirculation here. So this matches up with these, and the trade winds matches up with this circulation cell, and the polar easterlies matches up with the polar circulation cell. So so we've got the westerlies, and we've got the polar easterlies. If we look at the pattern as a function of latitude, and we say wind towards the east and wind towards the west, it looks something like this when we've got the equator here, and we've got about roughly 30 south and then 60 south, and similarly 30 and 60 north. The pattern, this plots, we've got essentially some somewhat weak polar easterlies in the northern hemisphere, strong westerlies in the mid-latitudes, and then we've got these trade winds that are strongest on either side of the equator. Looks something about like this. And then we've got the strong westerlies again, and some weak easterlies in the polar latitudes. And so this means that in this direction, at these latitudes, the wind's blowing that way, and at these latitudes, it's blowing accordingly. And so this wind blowing over the surface of the planet, and especially the oceans in our case, is imparting forces upon the ocean and that drives circulation in the surface ocean features. And so we'll talk about next how that impacts the movement of surface ocean waters.